You are listening to an exclusive interview on Bass Musician Magazine. The interview starts now.
Hey everybody, this is Raul for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of chatting with bassist Hansford Rowe.
Glad to be here.
Hansford is a renowned fusion bassist, been playing for a long time. I want to go all the way back to the beginning. How did you get your start in music and on bass?
Well, I got my first bass when I was 14, I think. My father bought me a bass. I had been playing cello, classical cello, but I got involved in drugs and growing my hair, and it was 1968 when I was 14. So this is some time ago. First I had an EB3, and it was stolen on the street in New York. I lived in New York at the time. It was my fault. I abandoned it accidentally. I still regret it. And then I got a bass made at a place called the Guitar Lab. It was a 4-string fretless. And I used that bass in Gong for many years. It was my only bass for a while. And I loved that bass. I still have it somewhere around here. And then eventually, as Gong was reasonably successful, I met wall basses in England at that time as well, in the 70s. I ventured out of classical childhood, lessons into the world of rock and eventually jazz in my teens.
Now, from what I remember, you're essentially kind of departing from the classical realm. You're self-taught on the bass aspect?
It's true. I mean, I had lessons on nothing to do with improvising, just some classical lessons on cello. Mm-hmm. So when I moved into the bass, I kind of, I broke with that world and began to teach myself how to play the bass lines I heard on records, right? Mm-hmm. Which in those days were the kind of 60s rock records that I loved. Everything from Led Zepp to Hendrix, etc. And then fairly quickly, when I was in my mid to late teens, I got interested in the earliest fusion, the early Mile stuff, mm-hmm. and the earliest Weather Report before Jacko, and I loved that. And then that took me into free jazz, and I went all over the place in the mid 70s with the enthusiasm of the idea of playing improvised music, right? Mm-hmm. And during those years, I had to just teach myself as best I could. At one point, I took lessons with Buster Williams in New York, and those were formative, if not really informative. Mm-hmm. And I mean that in a good way. He was not proactive. He would play, and then he'd say, "Play this," and I would do my best to play across a blues or something, and then he wouldn't say much. He sent me to an audition with Horace Silver, which I failed horribly at. That was a major lesson for me. I was just not ready to play at that level at all then, and I think he probably knew that. But I think fondly of those days now that I've recovered.
Yeah. Well, in the whole educational process, it is interesting because you could have somebody that may be able to give you what you needed, and actually that might have been even an introspective look so you could figure out where you were standing in order to move forward.
The way I learned and the way I teach are not that connected. Sometimes I wonder about that contradiction. I feel like I have a few students and have had over the years, private students, and I always feel like I should just give them all the tips and anything I've learned over the years as quickly as I can, in the hopes that they get as much benefit as they possibly could, as early and quickly as they could. But that isn't the way I learned at all. I slowly figured out how to make it work, and so this is an inherent contradiction in the way I teach, but I could never teach like Buster taught me, and although I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
So life is complicated.
Moving forward, you were a member of Gong, founding member of Gongzilla, and right. had more recently been with HR3. It's a trio. After
Gongzilla, I decided to really, Bon Lazaga, the guitar player in Gongzilla, had done many years from like 95 to almost 2010, so something like 15 years of jazz rock together, And, it was a continuation of our days with Gong. So we had many of the Gong people play with us, and the band went through many, kind of morphed into many different things over the years. But when Alan played with us, Alan Holsworth, who had played with us in the original Gong, Gary Husband, David Fuzinski, a lot of great fusion guys. And when Bon and I had 15 years of pushing that rock up the hill, which is, trying to play fusion as best we could from 95 to 2010, we decided to take a break. And I wanted to do something really different, things I hadn't done before. So I formed a much more jazz-like trio. Initially, I did a record with a jazz guitarist from Barcelona named Jordi Torrens. That's called Moment, that record, that band. It was acoustic guitar and very introspective, very romantic, really different from Gongzilla. Mm-hmm. And then I developed the trio with this young guitar player named Julian Sandiford, who I've been working with for the last 6 years and watching him grow up. He was 20 then, now I think he's just turned 27. And we've developed a really strong and profound musical relationship. It's where we've developed an interest in a certain process and certain kind of ways of looking at the details and how to develop things together over these years, which now I really kind of cherish. So when we work together, there's all this developed common ground, which we don't have to repeat or discuss. We could just move forward from. And I really appreciate that. As I get older, I like his youth, but I also like the ability to have an established, firm groundwork of common references and goals, so that when we write together, it flows forward really in a solid way. And that's not very specific, but it's almost as though the process has become as important to me as the results. Not that they aren't important, the results. I want to always finish with a record that I'm proud of and that I want to put on and want to get pleasure listening to. I want that to end that way. But I enjoy, it could take 2 years of working with him so that we get the right tunes together and they suit us. And I enjoy that really a lot.
It is certainly different, and many groups are in different places where you'll hear about a group going into a studio for a week and cranking out an album or something. Right. And then you'll have others that'll have a project that will go for a year or two until they're pleased with what actually ended up coming out. So there's no wrong way to go about this. It is all part of that creative process and how you get it. Now, the last album that you had released was Decadence.
Well, it's HR3 became
a new thing.
Yeah, it became a new thing. It's I had called the trio HR3 for lack of a better name. And as we started working on a second record after the first HR3 record, which is called HR3, it's just a trio, drums, bass, and guitar. I realized that I wanted to have a slightly more complex sound, and Julian and I, this young guitar player, Julian Sandiford, he and I went to Paris and recorded with my old cohorts from Gong, which were François Cause and Benoît Morlin, the brother of Pierre Morlin, the drummer from Gong. And we recorded the basics for the album in Paris. And so we called it Gong Expresso. It's lots of vibes and marimba and percussion a la Gong, and all instrumental. And it's essentially the basic group, at least in terms of the rhythm section, of Gong Expresso as I knew it back in the old days, in the 70s, with Pierre. Pierre is gone, but we had his brother Benoit and François, who were original members from the time when I joined Gong, which was its jazz rock period. And then Julian, who I had just done a record with. So I love that record. It came out better than I expected, which isn't, even when you spend 2 years working on something, it's to prepare to see what will happen. You know what I mean? And hopefully that's something bigger than what you had even prepared for. If that's true, then you're onto something good. You know what I mean? And that totally happened with this record. We recorded the whole thing in 1 week in Paris. And during that week, I had some trials. I arrived late because of a canceled flight. I then fell down the stairs in the apartment I was staying in fractured a rib at the beginning of the sessions. went to the emergency room. And then the last 2 days I had kidney stones. And back to the hospital, to the same emergency room I had been in before. They were like, who's this American who keeps coming in here? But we managed to do a really good rhythm track, and we mixed it here in Montreal. And I'm thrilled with it. So that was called Gong Expresso, right? The name of the band was Gong Expresso. And Julie and I have a new project now where we're carrying on, morphing again as we write kind of similar type tunes, but now it's in a trio with a terrific drummer in Montreal who's been around for a while named Jamie Thompson. And he plays a kind of kit that has mixed percussion in it and a Vibes marimba triggered Pearl mallet station. And he does it all at the same time. So we can get a kind of best of all, keep the group small, which is my preference these days, but have a bigger palette, a bigger sound. So we can get vibes, marimba, percussion, drums into the guitar trio. And that's what we're working on now. And
I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, how are you getting your sound gear-wise? What are you using?
Well, I still use my basic basses that have come, that I prefer and I've gotten used to using over the years. One which is an old Warwick that I've had since 86, this one. I have a bunch of Warwicks and I love them all. Most of them are kind of specific to some purpose. I have several that are built just for playing in just intonation, which is a different tuning system. So I have those which are my go-to basses for the primary things I want to do. But then recently I got a Supro Huntington, which is a fat-sounding four-string I haven't played it since in many years, and I really enjoy that. I found it quite inspiring, actually, to be reminded of my youth in this way. It's a short scale. Of course, I can't use it to do the kind of things I'm used to doing. The compositions that I write on bass are a bit different, but I really like it, and I immediately started writing single-note bass lines that I used to love when I was a kid, So that's fun. So the Supro and the Warwicks, and I've been using Ashdown amps. I love them, and I love Mark Videt also, which is one of the reasons I like Ashdowns. He's a good guy. I don't use many pedals. I've been using a few recently. I saw some interesting pedals at NAMM this year called Spaceman, which I really liked. I may get a couple of those. But in general, I prefer to get tone that's coming out of the instrument and my fingers and the amp, as opposed to too manipulated. I do use an envelope follower occasionally for soloing, things like that. And I've been using DR strings for decades. And Layla pedals, I have a bunch of their stuff, the German company Layla. I love their mono volume pedal. It's a tremendous piece of gear.
If I recall correctly, you have a project in the works with Tau guitars. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Tau is a company. It's a couple of luthiers from Brussels, and they make high-end, really, really high design. It's more like high watchmaking or something than it is your typical luthier stuff. The things are looked at in great, great detail and always have a kind of design purpose behind them in terms of the overall look and feel of the instrument, not just to make a bass, but to make a statement kind of. And I really like the work they do. So a while back, we decided to look at what would be my ultimate bass. And I also work with an industrial designer here in Montreal who's not particularly involved in the music scene, but is a great industrial designer. And so the three of us have kind of combined to see what happens when you do that. Top high-end luthiers, an industrial designer, and a bass player. And so hopefully by NAMM next year, we'll have something to show. That's why it's kind of like doing a record. I'm not quite sure what it's going to be exactly, but we put a lot of work into it, and hopefully that comes to something interesting.
Very interesting. Well, we're going to make sure that we keep our eyes open to see this.
You can check out Tao. They have a website, and there's some beautiful guitars there.
Wow. And moving forward, what plans and projects? I know that, again, you've got the new trio that you're working with. What can we look for in the future? Well,
the new trio has a timeline headed towards a few concerts this summer. I have one I just was offered a festival in Canada here in June, late June. That'll be our first show. Otherwise, we prepare to shoot for doing a record around Christmas time. And then hopefully in 2020 we'll actually start to play more gigs and promote that record and do more of a thing. I've kind of lost interest in the promo stuff. I'm getting old now, and I want to play live, but I don't want to do all the work that is involved in making sure I get to play live. Yeah. So it's kind of another contradiction. I'm comfortable here at home.
I can relate to that, and I know that so many people that are maybe not in the business romanticize about how the life on the road and town to town and whatnot, and we have had some friends that are on the younger end of the spectrum that are playing the little bars and they're couch surfing as they go, and they're packed into their car. And it may seem fun when you're 20, but when you add on a few years,
it is fun when you're 20.
Yes, but after you kind of go, not so much. Now, if people want to stay on top of what you're doing so that they may be able to enjoy the touring record stuff, the best place to look, I saw on Facebook, Hansford.Rowe.official.
Yeah, that's the official artist page. I also have, if you just Google it, there's my personal page, which is mostly music. I don't do much proselytizing about politics or any of that stuff. It's just music and the occasional car. So
there you go. And another place to look is GongExpresso.com.
Right, that's where you can get the latest record, and otherwise just Googling my name and bass will take you to all kinds of things. There's a YouTube channel, there's SoundCloud, there's Instagram, and so forth.
Hansford, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to chat with us. Folks, you've seen him here. Hansford Rowe on Bass Musician Magazine.
Thanks for bassing out with us here on BassMusicianMagazine.com.